So now we're getting into one of my absolute favorite lessons in the entire book and sort of in the entire flow methodology, and really one of my favorite scientific revelations that came in my research. And so to take us back very quickly to the last lesson, we talked about how, everything solid is also energy, and it can be converted back and forth. That solid is neither created nor destroyed, right? So when we talk about energy, I imagine that you mostly think about energy as something that's sort of moving in waves, right? That would have a frequency that, sort of flows and is immovable and that sort of thing, or is very movable and that sort of thing, right? And then if you think about, let's say, the chair that you're sitting on, or perhaps the table or desk that you might be at while watching this, I imagine you wouldn't think that that is moving in waves, right? You would think, no, this is very static. It's very solid. It's not moving at all. And so from our last lesson, you might think, okay, then if something's solid, it has to sort of break down and convert into energy, and therefore have a wave frequency, and therefore be something that's sort of flowing and moving once it converts or breaks down. And that if something is energetic, it's sort of moving and flowing. And in order for it to be something that's solid, it would have to then come back into solid form. And that's what scientists thought for a very, very long time too. It makes a lot of logical sense. I mean, you don't imagine that the chair that you're sitting on right now is actually also moving or flowing like the ocean, right? It doesn't seem like that's possible. Here's the neat thing. It is. So scientists discovered that everything that is solid is actually energy at the exact same time as we are observing it as solid. And everything that's energy is actually also solid, so that they're both at the same time. So everything, like your body right now, is actually both solid and flowing in waves and frequency and changeable and all of that sort of stuff. It's both at the same time. No matter how solid your body or your hand or whatever feels right now, it's also moving and flowing all the time as energy. And here's how they discovered this. They basically were sending particles through a particle detector. And so they have this, and I'll add some links for anybody that's as interested in the science of this stuff as I am. I'll add some links about the actual science of this, because of course I'm just going to give the highlights as it sort of relates to us being able to create our dream life. But so they had basically slits. They had these sort of double slits, and they were trying to detect particles. And when they turned the particle detector on, the particles lined up nice and neat as they would as solid. They would just have this nice, neat line because they're solid, they're predictable, they know exactly where they're going to be. When they turned the particle detector off, then they immediately saw a wave pattern at the same time. So what they realized was the factor as to whether a particle showed itself in its wave form or in its solid form was whether or not they had the particle detector on. Now that's super interesting, and like famed quantum physicist or early quantum physicist Werner Heisenberg basically described this as to observe is to disturb. And what that means is that by simply turning on the particle detector, the particles knew that we as the observers, or in that case, the scientists as the observers, were looking for particles. So it showed that aspect of itself. It showed itself as particles. When the scientists turned the particle detector off, the particles now knew that we were no longer looking for particles, and instead responded by showing waves. So what that means is either the particles are psychic, which is, I guess, possible, but not as likely, or the state in which they choose to show themselves is based upon the expectations and the observations of the people observing it. When the scientists expected to see particles, by turning on the particle detector, they saw particles. When the scientists expected to see waves, by turning off the particle detector, they saw waves. Now, what's super cool about this is that if you take that to the next conclusion, that means that we, as sort of the particle detectors in our own life, through our own expectations when we go out into the world, are telling the particles in our life how to come together and what aspect to sort of show of themselves. Our expectations are actually directly affecting the reality that we experience. So if you think of yourself as literally a reality detector, and we're going to talk in later lessons about sort of what's set up your expectations and how to shift your expectations so that basically when you're turning on your particle detector, which is essentially like when you're awake and interacting with the world, that's when everything sort of springs into being from its energy state and is sort of showing itself as these solid things in your life that are still energy at the same time. Then what you want to do is make sure that we are resetting whatever these underlying unconscious expectations are. Because it's those expectations, much like turning on the particle detector, you're sort of turning on your own expectation detector or your own life detector, right? And it's set with, just like when the scientists were like, I expect to see waves, and now suddenly there's this nice wave pattern because I've turned off the particle detector. And now I expect to see particles, and there they are, and they're lining up, right? And it's the same thing for our lives. We are getting what we expect to get because we are like the particle detectors of our lives. And we are sending out, by just simply existing and moving about our lives are sort of popping into being in the way that essentially the particles believe we expect them to show up. That's sort of the bottom line. Now, I hope that blows your mind as much as it blew mine. Seriously, when I first read it, I was like, are you kidding me right now? Because, you know, there's a lot of talk in the world about manifesting, and there's certainly, you know, tons and tons and tons of books about, you know, the law of attraction and setting your expectations and affirmations and yada yada. And that's all wonderful. You know, but you see a lot of people where it isn't working, like that doesn't work. And I thought to myself, when I started researching for my work, you know, what is happening? What is the factor? And can I find something in the scientific world that starts to allow me to build a foundation? And I love having a scientific foundation. Yes, I'm very intuitive, but I want a scientific foundation. I want to see what's out there that I can say is provable as much as anything is provable. We'll talk more about that too. And so when I saw this and I was like, aha. So maybe the reason that you've said affirmations by the zillion and you're not seeing anything shifting is because your expectations, i.e. your particle detector, have been set to only expect certain things. And that's how they're showing up. So you can say affirmations all you want, but if they're not the right frequency and you're not shifting those expectations at a very real level, then you're not seeing any difference, right? Because you're still expecting a certain thing. Consciously and unconsciously, this is where a lot of people get caught up. And so my goal as we continue to move forward is to show you how to literally reset your particle detector, your life detector. So we're changing your underlying expectations. And now you're seeing life come together in the way that you genuinely want it to come together, if that makes sense. So I hope you're excited about this lesson. I will link a bunch more of the science if any of the rest of you are really super interested in the science. If you're not, there'll be a worksheet underneath that will give you some things to think about as we move forward. See you in the next lesson.